Save your PS5 before it's too late. The PS6 is real, and here's what we know. Sony's gonna make you a professional gamer. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. We have a stacked news video this week, but before I jump into it, just wanted to say thanks for all the birthday wishes on my last video. I appreciate all of the kindness from you guys, and it kind of made my weekend, so I figured I'd give you a shout out for once. I don't know if you can see it behind me, but I ended up grabbing the May 4th of last year UCS set, the Land Speeder. I saw mixed reviews on it when it came out, mainly because people like the prequels now, I think, but I had a lot of fun with it. One of the better builds I've ever done, and not that much Technic in it, so I had a ton of fun with that. All right, let's jump into this PlayStation news. So it looks like Sony has yet another partnership with a game studio. It doesn't look like they actually bought this studio, but it looks like they might be building up to buy them because they're doing the classic Sony thing. The studio is Jetpack Interactive, who is a PC port house. They helped Sony port over God of War, which is how the relationship, I'm sure, kind of started, and then it ballooned out from there. Sony's entering a partnership with them to make a game for PS5 and PC, and because it is for PS5 and PC, I would assume it's going to be one of these 10 or whatever live service games that Sony wants to have made in the next few years. I saw a few tweets kind of on this news being like, oh, we shouldn't be excited for whatever they're making because they're just a port house, but like, I don't really understand that mentality at all. Most of the studios that Sony acquired over time, they started out as like nothing and made games that did really well on the PS2 or PS3. Then Sony bought them and they made their best games. I mean, just off the top of my head, Naughty Dog and Sucker Punch are great examples of that, and Insomniac Games. It took a longer time for Insomniac to get bought, but they still followed that same mold of starting from the bottom and then working their way up with Sony's guidance and leadership. So what's to say that this new studio, Jetpack Interactive, can't really do the same thing? And I honestly think this is a pretty smart move on Sony's part. You know, give these smaller studios a budget to make a AAA game for the PS5, and if it sells well, then they get bought, and if it doesn't sell well, then, you know, they can figure out what to do next. You know, it's not like they're doing what Microsoft is doing, where they made the initiative and called it a quadruple A studio, where we're going to see the biggest and best games that kind of advance the industry forward, and then all we've heard about out of that studio is just that it's a complete disaster, that Perfect Dark is a mess. They had to bring in Crystal Dynamics to help them develop the game. People are leaving that studio en masse. There's apparently leadership problems. So when you start a studio with the intention of making a game versus taking a studio that you've already worked with, that already has experience making games cohesively as a team, I know they didn't make a game, but they worked on porting one of the best games ever made, which is good enough in my opinion. It's probably going to result in at least some success. So I think the play here is good. We also saw Sony pick up a studio in February. I forgot what they're called, but they're basically a studio that's made up of veterans from Supermassive Games. So the people behind something like Until Dawn or the Dark Pictures anthology or The Quarry, you know, some of the coolest horror games out right now. And they picked up a smaller studio made up of veterans from that studio to make new PlayStation IP, which is a really smart move, again, in my opinion, because, you know, they're working on a game that might be inspired by Psycho, which sounds great. So yeah, Sony's got their main studios. They've got Naughty Dog, they've got Sucker Punch, they've got Insomniac making stuff like Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima 2, The Last of Us Part 3, a rumored new IP from Naughty Dog. We also have Ben Studio making a new game in a new universe, so a totally new IP. And then now we have all these smaller studios making new games as well, which is great because you can contrast it with what Xbox is doing, which is they bought a bunch of studios that already existed for a long time during the Xbox One generation, and we have seen almost nothing from any of those studios in terms of Xbox exclusives. I mean, things are really gearing up now with Redfall finally, and of course Hellblade 2 is nowhere to be seen, the very first game that was announced for the Xbox Series X. But yeah, you know, I think what PlayStation is doing is smart. They've got a tried and true method here, and I'm excited to see what comes of this partnership with Jetpack Interactive. But if it's good, I bet you Sony will buy that studio. So this next news story is about a new patent that Sony is filing that will make you good at video games. Now they're calling this like a virtual dojo, but what it really looks like from the patent image that we're able to see is something like AimLab on PC. So if you've never played around with AimLab, basically it's a game that teaches you how to play specific first-person shooters. It gives you little drills to run where you can mess around with weapons that are basically from the games that you play. So Apex Legends has a level where you can play with guns that are like from Apex Legends, or CSGO or Warzone. You know, all these games that don't really give you much of a practice mode to learn the weapons and really figure out how to play. I actually got into AimLab for, I think it was Rainbow Six Siege when everything was locked down, and it was actually pretty cool how much better I got. I also started watching replays of my footage footage. I was really putting in some effort to get better at online competitive games, and it was fun for a summer, but I think this is cool to have something like this on the PlayStation 5 that comes directly from Sony. What I would really like to see is Sony kind of branch out, sort of like AimLab, I guess, could, and make levels with the actual makers of the games that you're training for, right? So you could have a Fortnite level that's officially like sponsored by Epic Games. It has the actual weapons from Fortnite in it. You can practice with those guns and then get way better at Fortnite without just playing the same game over and over again and getting super frustrated because you're consistently placing like 97th place. Or you could play Apex Legends with all the weapons from that, or Destiny 2. You can load in all the exotics and maybe try out an exotic before spending a bunch of in-game currency on it. And honestly, this seems like something that could actually be real. We've seen some other Sony patents that look like they're never actually going to come out, but like I just said, this one actually seems like it could be real, and it has some legitimate use because it already exists over on PC. And there are a bunch of rumors swirling that we'll see Counter-Strike 2 this month, or CSGO 2 from Valve, and people really want that game on console, and that game has an extremely steep learning curve. So if it does make its way over to PS5, having a sort of AimLab competitor directly made by Sony built into the PS5's operating system, that just makes a whole lot of sense to me. But before that, we obviously have the new Discord integration to look forward to. The rumored date from Tom Henderson over at Insider Gaming is that this new update with the Discord integration is officially going to launch on March 8th. That's in the beta right now. And honestly, I hope that date comes true. I believe it could, just because I've been using the new beta version of the PS5 software for like a month now, and I've had virtually zero issues with it. Everything just works as well as it's supposed to, in my opinion. Like my PS5 is behaving exactly the same as it did before, but it has a few new features. So I bet you'll probably see that update around March 8th, which is awesome. All right, next up, we got to talk about the PlayStation 6 because we kind of got a dual confirmation here. One of them is that the PS6 is in active development, and Mark Cerny, the guy behind the PlayStation 5, is sort of spearheading this campaign at Sony to get the PlayStation 6 made. And B, this kind of confirms all the rumors we've been hearing that the PlayStation 5 Pro will not happen. But let's start out with the PlayStation 6 news. All we really are hearing from multiple sources that are kind of corroborating each other at this point is that Sony is officially working on the PlayStation 6. They're looking at the next generation now that they've got the PS5 sort of figured out. And this timing makes so much sense when you consider that we're allegedly going to hear about the PS5 Slim very soon, probably around May or June of this year, and then they'll launch that. And then you combine that with the rumor that the PS5 Pro is not happening. And yeah, Sony's getting out the revised PS5 that's basically going to be, the Gen 2 that makes everything work as perfectly as possible. And then they can move on and look to the future with the PlayStation 6. And honestly, I'm super happy to hear that Mark Cerny is working on it. I know people were making fun of him leading up to the PS5 launch because of that Mark Cerny's Power Hour talk he gave with the whole SSD thing and why the PS5 works the way it does and what the thought process was with it. But from pretty much every metric, the PS5 is a success in my opinion. And honestly, as someone who's owned every PlayStation console pretty much at launch, this is the one that I've never really had to worry about any hardware issues occurring on. It doesn't sound loud ever, like the fan never really spins up. This is one of the quietest consoles I've ever owned. It never really heats up all that much. It plays games just as well as it did the day I got it. It's still getting great experiences 2 years in. The operating system is super quick. There's not a ton of loading. You don't have to wait on the PlayStation Store for things to load ever. You can download stuff from your phone to the console. It'll turn on in rest mode and everything will work. Like everything about the PlayStation 5 seems to be a massive improvement, not only over the PS4, but also the PS4 Pro. So to know that Mark Cerny was kind of like the guy behind all of that on the PS5, I think, yeah, and from Sony's perspective, it's a serious no-brainer to put him on the PlayStation 6. I remember when I was in middle school, one of my buddies who really got me back into the PlayStation ecosystem, he bought a PlayStation 3 at launch when it was $600. We were talking and he was like, yeah, they're probably already working on the PlayStation 4. And I was like, there's no way. But then you think about it, they have to do a lot of hardware development to make these things perform as well as possible, as cheap as possible. So it's not just like they're trying to make the greatest gaming console of all time, bar none, and not worrying about the price. They got to go in knowing what they want the price point to be when this thing eventually comes out. And they've got to fine tune and work with AMD and all these different hardware manufacturers to make sure each and every part is perfect, can last under a heavy load for a long time, and is durable and is cost effective. So to think that, yeah, this generation's probably going to be 9 or 10 years like all the other generations were, well, that basically puts us on the timeline right now that we would have been on the PS4 when they started working on the PlayStation PlayStation 5. So it's actually kind of cool to think about how far they work ahead. Honestly, that bit them in the ass a little bit with the PS4 and Xbox One generation because they held on to those consoles for a couple years due to the recession, and then they released them and they were underpowered, which is a huge reason why we ended up seeing the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. But it looks like this time around they didn't do that. They released the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S into the wild despite shortages on all the parts, and we're going to get a normal length generation. Now, I know there's a negative way to look at this where you say, hey, we kind of beta tested the PS5 for 2 years, now the generation is finally starting. But if you're paranoid about your PS5 breaking down, you're going to want to know about this new hardware mod. One of the coolest things about the PS5, in my opinion at least, is that it's so good at cooling. Obviously, when you look at the giant fan inside the device and all of the heat dissipation techniques they're using, and overall, when you look at the new PS5 that just came out a few months ago, the new hardware revision, they've basically got it down to a science of how to cool this thing off, which again will help with the longevity of the console, which is great because stuff these days isn't really designed to last all that long. But it seems like, fingers crossed, like I just talked about for a while, the PS5 is built to last. We saw that big rumor last month I kind of called BS on about the liquid metal leaking out of the APU if you open up your console, which like was happening allegedly to consoles that were sitting on the shelf. Then it turned out to be a mistranslated tweet and it was just a huge mess. The reason I was skeptically calling BS on that to begin with is because of how well the PS5 is designed. But if you want to take your SSD cooling to the next level, you have to check out this hardware mod. So this device you're seeing on screen now is called the Graugear G PS5 HSO1-COV. The article says this cooler's main selling point is its copper heatsink that protrudes out of the PS5's NVMe housing to increase heat dissipation. So if you look at the picture of this thing, it's pretty simple, I think, to see what's going on. So basically this heatsink goes on top of your SSD. So I'm assuming this would only work with SSDs that don't come with a heatsink attached. And then there's a piece of copper that kind of hangs off the top of it and goes over the fan of your PS5. So as your SSD heats up, the heat is carried from your SSD all the way up that copper, out the top heatsink and into the fan where it's blown out the other side, and it keeps your SSD cooler. So why would you want to keep your SSD cool? Well, because of the speeds that SSDs read and write, they heat up very quickly, which is again why Sony recommends and basically requires you to use a heatsink with the SSD in the first place. They don't want it melting components inside your PlayStation 5, which is like the kind of worst thing that can happen. But the main reason you want to keep your SSD cool is that it slows down if it heats up. So in my PC, I have an NVMe drive. There's not enough space for me to use one that has a heatsink built into it. So it heats up pretty quick, and I have noticed the transfer speeds slowing down a little bit. But thankfully, because it's one of the faster SSDs you can get right now, it never really causes that much of an issue for me. But in the PS5, with it being in such an enclosed space, you could see why you would want a heatsink there. Now, I'm really curious if this actually works, because over on the Steam Deck side of the fence, JSOX, which is like one of the main accessory companies for the Steam Deck, they made custom back shells for the Steam Deck that have a metal heatsink built onto them, and they actually not only improve frame rate on the Steam Deck, but they also keep it cooler. And some people are saying that the battery lasts longer because it's not running as hot, but I can't verify that. The point is that it actually works, and keeping the Steam Deck cooler makes it work better. So you could see the same logic being extended here to the PlayStation 5. And the other cool thing is that getting the side plate off of the PS5 and installing this heatsink into your console is pretty dang easy. I'd honestly say it's easier than replacing the SSD in the Steam Deck because, you know, a lot of people who are doing that fried their actual battery. Another cool thing is that it comes along with an extra cover for the NVMe drive bay, because obviously if you have that copper piece sticking out, the one that comes with your console isn't going to work. So that was smart that they don't just have it be sitting there in the open air. I know that the side plate kind of covers it up pretty well, but you still want that extra protection where you can get it. The other thing I'm really curious about here is price, because getting a heatsink for an SSD is honestly pretty cheap. I think it's only like 15 or 20 bucks on top of the main SSD you buy, but this is obviously more of a machine thing that's designed specifically for the PlayStation 5, which means the prices are going to be jacked up. But I honestly kind of want to get my hands on one of these and test it out with an NVMe drive, and then test out the Samsung 980 Pro with the heatsink that I've had in my PS5 for a little over, I think 2 years now, maybe even a year and a half, I don't know. But yeah, I would really like to see if this actually makes a difference, because as you know, if you watched my very first demo of putting an external SSD inside your PS5, I used an NVMe drive without without a heatsink, and the PS5 just let me do it, and it worked fine. I transferred a game to it, and it never gave me a warning about heat or anything like that. So knowing that we can put an SSD without a heatsink in the PS5 and it'll work, I'm really curious if this will actually work. But we got to know how much it's going to cost first. But first impressions, there's a lot of stuff that seems wacky when it comes to accessories and hardware mods and things like that. This just seems smart to me, right? Like, you don't need it, but it will extend the longevity of not only your console, but your SSD, which I think is pretty cool.